Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 24 of the regular season between the Sharks and the Anaheim Ducks, in which the Sharks have managed to win 6-0, technically their biggest win of the season, at least by goal differential. And what this also marks is the Sharks' first actual winning streak of the season, if you don't count a single win as a winning streak, which I of course do not. This being now 2 wins in a row, going back to that 3-2 overtime victory against the St. Louis Blues. And this one didn't necessarily start out all that well for the San Jose Sharks. In the first period, they would have the only goal of the game coming from Tomas Hertl. However, it was the Ducks who were piling on most of the shots and most of the chances in that first period, and yet Devan Dubnik was a difference maker there to keep the Ducks off the board and keep the Sharks' lead alive. Come second period, just within the first few seconds, the Sharks would manage to make it 2-0, and that would be the score at the end of 40 minutes. In the third period, things would begin to open up a bit. Obviously, the Ducks were going to look to try and get at least one goal on the board to cut into the Sharks' 2-0 lead, but because things opened up, the Sharks took full advantage, getting some nice goals, really. First one from Erik Karlsson, then we had Timo Meier, Kevin Labanc, and then finally his first goal of his NHL career, Handemark, gets on the board to make it 6-0. And as I said, some really nice one. Kane with a beautiful play to set up Kevin Labanc for that 5th goal of the game. Timo Meier a great toe drag, and then putting a perfectly placed shot over John Gibson to make it 4-0 as well. And so, as I said, the Sharks' biggest win of the season, at the very least score-wise, and it certainly was quite fun to watch, especially that third period. First thing to talk about would, of course, be Devan Dubnik. He gets the call here tonight, not really a surprise after his great performance in the previous game against the St. Louis Blues. And what's probably the most interesting question now is whether or not Devan Dubnik will actually get the start tomorrow, because he certainly put up a pretty good case for it. As I said in the first period, the Ducks were the team that got the majority of the chances and the shots, and yet Devan Dubnik had to make multiple key saves to keep the 1-0 Sharks lead alive. And then you take a look early in the second period, just moments before the Sharks actually scored to make it 2-0 early in the second, the Ducks had an opportunity to tie up the game, and Dubnik had to come up with a huge save to keep them once again off the board. Had Dubnik let that puck in and it ended up being a 1-1 game, you couldn't necessarily have blamed Dubnik in that situation. It was certainly a tough save to make, and yet this game could have looked completely different in a situation like that. So Dubnik being able to bail out the San Jose Sharks early on into the second period definitely helped lead to this eventual 6-0 victory. So he played a big part. So as I said, made a huge case for being able to start the following game tomorrow. And I do still think Jones probably should get the start, because in my eyes, I would see Jones getting the start tomorrow in the back-to-back against the Anaheim Ducks, and then going back to Dubnik for the following game against the Golden Knights, because obviously that's going to be a tougher matchup, and right now Dubnik is looking better than Martin Jones. But just the fact that Dubnik is even a consideration in a season like this where games are so cramped together is a testament to how good he looked here tonight. Next, I will talk about Erik Karlsson, and maybe you're getting a bit tired of talking about Erik Karlsson, but it's very hard to watch a Sharks game, any of these past few Sharks games, without noticing that Erik Karlsson is far and away the most skilled player on the ice in each of those last few games, at least for the San Jose Sharks. I won't really say much about what the other team is icing. Erik Karlsson once again with a spectacular performance, especially on the offensive side. He's just making things look easy. Early on in the year, he looked like he wasn't necessarily putting in too much effort. I'm sure that wasn't necessarily the case, but it definitely looked that way. And yet right now, it seems as though he's putting in so much effort that it actually looks effortless with how easily he's sort of just walking around opposing players in the offensive zone and in the defensive zone to start breakouts or to continue offensive zone pressure. He's making it look so easy. He's getting some great opportunities. He scored again here tonight. He had this one pass that he was looking for a potential breakaway for Kevin Labanc. Unfortunately, Labanc was not able to get his stick on the pass. Otherwise, it would have been a great chance for Labanc. And it was just such a pass that showed off such great vision and forethought from Erik Karlsson. It kind of reminded me of Prime Thornton with that opportunity. And so while there were small mistakes in Erik Karlsson's game absolutely here tonight, you can't necessarily say it was a flawless or perfect game. The fact remains is that you can't actually say that about any player in the NHL. You can't say that about Connor McDavid, who is widely regarded as the best player in the NHL right now. I'm sure he doesn't play flawless and perfect games. Even Wayne Gretzky, widely regarded as the best player ever in the NHL, did not play flawless and perfect games. But the fact is that the small mistakes that these top NHL players do make game in and game out are massively overshadowed by the insane plays that they can make on both sides of the ice, and that's exactly what happened here for Erik Karlsson tonight. Yes, late in the second period, there was an opportunity where he got walked around by one of the Ducks players, and that led to a decent chance for Anaheim, but that is very much overshadowed by the amount of great plays that Erik Karlsson set up offensively. And so the fact remains is that he's been looking so good in the past few games, and it hasn't just been 1 or 2 games here or there that makes you think, maybe he doesn't last. The fact that it's been now 4, 5, 6 games in a row for Erik Karlsson makes it seem like this is now maybe a consistent thing that we can expect from him. So as long as he doesn't go down with yet another injury, fingers crossed in that regard, the Sharks seem to finally be getting the player that they were hoping to have gotten when they signed him to that mammoth $11.5 million contract. Remember when a few games ago I had said he was playing at around an $8 to $9 million level? It seems as though he's now at the very least in the double-digit millions at this point. Next, I'll talk about the Sharks' first line. This is a first line that was put together a few weeks ago. Kane, Couture, and Labanc, and at first they were looking fantastic, but in the past few games they had definitely slowed down. Couture was still potting in a couple of goals here or there and playing some decent defensive hockey, but Evander Kane had slowed down and was playing a bit more average. Kevin Labanc was also kind of falling off pretty significantly, so much so that in the previous game against the St. Louis Blues, he ended up getting benched and only getting about 10 minutes on the night, and took a couple of minor penalties, and it was a bit disastrous, so much so that it was actually a question of whether or not Labanc would manage to maintain a spot on the first line, or if someone like John Leonard would be bumped up into the lineup to replace him. But in the end, Booner, after this few days off rest and coming into this game Friday night against the Anaheim Ducks, he decides to leave Labanc on that top line, which I was actually kind of happy about. It's been very frequent in the Sharks' past, not just with Bob Booner, but with Peter DeBoer, and even going back to Todd McClellan, where the Sharks would put a forward line together, and it would work well for a few games, but then after a couple of games of not looking too hot, one of those players would be sent to a different line, and things would be juggled up. It was called the lined blender, and it was something that Peter DeBoer absolutely loved, in particular, loved abusing during his few years with the Sharks as head coach. And so I was actually pretty excited to see that Labanc was given yet another chance, even though obviously it didn't look very good in the previous game. And so hopefully this first line can remain together for at least the foreseeable future. You take a look at some of the other teams in the NHL, and a few of them certainly do have some lineup changes, frequent lineup changes, but then you look at a team like the Colorado Avalanche, Rantanen, Landeskog, McKinnon. This is a line that's basically always together, or at least you basically know that they can always come together at any moment. You take a look at the Vegas Golden Knights, Riley Smith, Jonathan Marchessault, and William Karlsson seem to be attached at the hips ever since the inception of the Vegas Golden Knights a few years ago. These players have been on the same line basically game in and game out, so it would be nice if the Sharks could have a line like that for themselves. And finally, I'd like to talk about sort of the state of the San Jose Sharks, because I know there were a lot of negative thoughts around the San Jose Sharks after this stretch of games. They just finished a 7-game homestand, which saw them go a pretty disappointing 2-4-1. But it was something that I mentioned a few weeks ago in a review, that the Sharks were moving into a stretch of 10 games, where they were going to be playing against the top 4 teams of the West Division, that being the St. Louis Blues, the Colorado Avalanche, the Vegas Golden Knights, and surprisingly, the very, very strong, out of nowhere really, Minnesota Wild. And so during those 10 games, it was obviously a struggle, though the Sharks did remain competitive in some. They also obviously had some really rough games, losing 6-2 to the Wild and 4-0 a couple of times to the Colorado Avalanche and Vegas Golden Knights. However, after they finish up their game tomorrow against the Anaheim Ducks and then have 2 more games against the tough Vegas Golden Knights, the Sharks will have a 13-game stretch that will see them play in 11 of those games, the other three bottom teams of the West Division, that being the Kings, the Coyotes, and the Ducks, with a couple of games sprinkled in there against the Minnesota Wild. And those 13 games will be make or break for the Sharks' season. When we come to that point, the Sharks will have finished up 27 games. And may I remind you, in a shortened 56-game season, that 13-game stretch represents almost a quarter of the entire year. So if the Sharks can put up a good record during those 13 games, and I'm not saying a 500 record of 6-6-1, but I'm talking about an actual very good record of something like 9-3-1 or even like 10-3 or something like that, then the Sharks can absolutely have a chance at making to the playoffs. But they absolutely need to assert themselves above the likes of the Ducks, Kings, and Coyotes if they want to even challenge for a spot in that top four and be able to squeak in by knocking off a team like maybe the Blues or maybe like the Wild as well. And I know there are, of course, after that stretch of games, some Sharks fans who feel as though the Sharks should be rebuilding or resetting or whatever you want to call it. But I can tell you that every single Sharks player at the moment and every single Sharks management at the moment is sort of full steam ahead at trying to make the playoffs. And I'd be lying if I said that I didn't want to see that happen. Yes, maybe in the end it would be smarter to not do that well this season and get a high pick in this coming draft. But, I'm a Sharks fan at first. I want to see some good hockey, and I'd love to see some playoff hockey played by the San Jose Sharks, especially since last year we didn't get to see any because they missed. And so if, I'll be holding out hope until it is mathematically impossible for the Sharks to make the playoffs. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow. They'll take on the Anaheim Ducks yet again. And I'm sure after losing 6-0, the Ducks will be out for some revenge. So we'll see if the Sharks can not only expand this winning streak to their first 3-game winning streak of the season, but we'll also see if they can get their first little sweep of one of these 2-game series on this strange year. Class dismissed.